It's not often that we have a good background to speak against. I don't know if you can see the snow falling outside the window, but it fills me with joy. And part of it is that when we have snow, it reminds us that there's a season and that God is in control of the seasons, and that as He promised to sustain the earth, He continues to sustain the earth. There. Got my serious head on, but these are things that bring me a lot of joy. Last week we looked at the topic of salvation and how, as Christians, we believe that we're saved out of sin and into being a kingdom of priests, just as God had promised to His people in the Exodus and also in 1 Peter chapter 2. Today we're going to look at a similar theme, but a different word. And if you know anything about me, you know that I love words. Words have a power to be able to create a picture in our minds. And words have a power to, in themselves, tell a whole story. The word today is the word redeem. It's used a lot in the scriptures. 52 times, according to Bible Gateway, the word redeemed is used, both Old Testament and New Testament. Much more if we do a search on redeem or redemption. It seems that it's very close to God's heart. And so, as Christians, we don't really do ourselves any favours by trying to dim down or replace some of the great words of the Bible. There's just too much there that tells us that it's important. So with that in mind, let's look at this idea of redemption. Now, in Hebrew, there are two meanings of redemption. The first is just to pay for something, but that can take the place of saving someone. So salvation and payment can be quite closely related in the Hebrew, but also there is a word which talks about standing in the place of. And I suppose the closest thing to this would be if, let's say, my wife, Lindsay, was captured and a ransom was being demanded, and being the good husband that I am, I went to the captors and said, look, take me in the place of my wife, and then we'll sort it out from there. And you know that I don't have the courage or the kindness to do that, but if I did, that would be to ransom or to redeem. And then so there is, in redemption, there is a sense of something being paid and something standing in the place of. So just bear that in mind. Now, the other meaning of redemption, and I think you have to think about this one, is to buy back. To buy back. Now, we're actually quite familiar with this because anyone who's got a mortgage is busy redeeming their mortgage or redeeming the property that they have mortgaged, so that you only get it at the end when the full price is paid, and actually more than the full price. But we're quite familiar with that idea. And to be honest with you, redemption is as much a financial or a legal term as it is a religious term. So when we read in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, for example, God talks about redeeming property, and that property might be people, actually. So buying back people or buying back land, or at the end of Jubilee, getting the title rights to that land again. So this is all finance and law. the price has to be paid for a thing. If we were going to talk about other legal matters, perhaps the idea that a life has to be given for a life would also come under the idea of redemption. How can somebody be redeemed? Well, when the price is paid, and it's an appropriate and agreed price, usually a price much greater than the price originally paid, and it has to be done in a timely way as well. So here are 5 lessons about redemption that might help us as Christians. Number 1, we need to understand how desperate we are. So it's bad news first, and like a spectrum, the news turns from ill to good. So let's bear that in mind. The fact is, if we read in passages like Romans chapter 3, we learn that there is no one who does any good. We're all in need of redemption. I'll perhaps pause there. There's no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All. That's you, that's me. I think one of the most difficult things for people to accept is that they're desperate. That we need to be redeemed. We need to be bought back. We are somebody else's property. Now, in Romans chapter 1 and 2, Paul is clear about this, that God's given over people to their wickedness. And in effect, he's just let them go to hell. Now, that would be bad news under any circumstances. But when Paul says it, we could accuse Paul of being a bit negative. But we could go to that apostle of love, John. What does he say? If we say that we have not sinned, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. One of the things about being a Christian I find more and more is that we can name stuff and own it. This is a Christian characteristic. To put our hands up, if you like, to say, yes, this describes me. Jesus said that he'd come for the lost sheep of Israel, not for the ones who counted themselves righteous. If a doctor came to you and said, I've discovered the cure for such a thing, you might be ever so pleased. But it wouldn't really mean anything to you until the doctor said, by the way, you've got it and I can cure it. So the bad news before the good news. When we think about redemption, it's because we're enslaved, we're captured, we're kidnapped, we're taken away. There is a ransom demand for us, a life for a life. And it's not a life well lived in most of our cases, is it? Owning it, saying, Lord, I'm desperate here. I can't afford the price. I haven't been good enough. I need someone to redeem me, to pay back what's owed. That's the first thing. And it's a sign of health to a Christian to name things as they are and not to say, well, I'm pretty good really. I think I think I've got a good chance. We don't. And that desperation I found well expressed by Solomon Northup, who wrote that book, 12 Years a Slave. Now, he shouldn't have been a slave. He was a freedman, but he was kidnapped and taken to the south of the United States. And there, for 12 years served as a slave for different so-called masters who thought they owned him. And he describes the sense of being in hell, the torment of hell. That's the torment of slavery. Well, being a captive, we need redemption. We need someone to sort out the ransom. Now, second lesson then, number 2. The ransom comes at a price. Now, the Old Testament is clear that the price, for example, for the sin of murder would be death. There are the famous examples of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And lots of people, I think, misunderstand this, and they think it'd be really good today if punishment was like that. It wouldn't be good at all. You don't get your eye back because you poke mine out. But there is a price to be paid. Do you know, even in unjust circumstances, think, for example, of those pirates off the coast of Somalia, you know, who go and kidnap and hijack ships. And then they bring them back to shore, and they start to look for bids. Who will buy the stuff? But they also ransom off the crew. There's a ransom price, and it's a high price. And if we think about our house, the house that we buy it back at a much greater price than is originally agreed in the title deed. There's a price to be paid. That price is the Lord Jesus Christ himself. A life for a life. And, you know, when you consider that passage in Philippians, for example, chapter 2, which talks about Jesus knowing that he's leaving the riches of heaven, that he counts it as nothing, and he goes to the cross, to death on a cross. When we think of his majesty and his glory, and that he's left all of that, and that he counts you and me worth dying for, well, we see that the price is very high, but the price has been paid once and for all. And there's nothing we can add to that. There's no good deed that we can do. There's no act of generosity that we can do. There's no will that we can make that will see us past our need of being redeemed. But Jesus paid it all. He paid the price for us. And it was the price of his life. And again, you know, in history, people have tried to pay off their debt. You know, there's countries like Italy, you know, where the big churches and the works of art, the religious works of art, they're all supposed to be sort of paying it forward so that God will somehow remember them, you know, in the future. But the price is paid, and the price is Jesus. He's the Lamb who was given. We'll think about this a little bit more because I'd like to look at the atonement. But for now, let's just say that to be redeemed, we need to know that we need to be redeemed. And there's a price to be paid. We have to acknowledge that. We have to know that for our sin, for our ill deeds, a price needs to be paid. And Jesus has paid it. Thirdly, this redemption, well, it needs to be taken in a timely way. I'll give you an illustration of this. Maybe that this will help. But you know, have you ever saved up 6 tokens to get a free coffee. Well, I did it recently at a fast food outlet, and of course I let it go past December the 31st, 2020, so I couldn't redeem my free drink. I'll have to pay for the next drink. I didn't accept it in a timely way. We have one life, and I like Land Rovers mainly because they represent a bit of rough and tough, but people put a sticker on their Land Rovers saying, "One life, live it." For redemption to be effectual, it needs to be within our lifetime. And preferably, I guess, within our conscious lifetime. In Corinthians, in one of his letters to the Corinthians, Paul says, now is the day of salvation. Of course, salvation there being that opportunity to be redeemed. Now it is. And look, don't tarry. Don't wait. We actually don't know what tomorrow holds. I keep on thinking of this, especially in a time of a pandemic. We don't know what we have tomorrow, but we have it clearly laid before us today. Yes, our desperate need. Yes, that there is a huge price to pay, but despite that price, Jesus has paid it, and he's ready today to hear our acknowledgement of him. And how daft would we be? How strange or ridiculous would we be if, having been kidnapped, I suppose like Terry Waite, he was the great hero when I was growing up, a quiet man who literally went to Lebanon as a price, as in a way he was offering himself to be a ransom, but surprised to find himself jailed, locked up for 5 years and chained against a radiator. Now, in our understanding of redemption, of ransom, we know that there is a longing to be free of that of that imprisonment, involuntary imprisonment. But imagine that the door is thrown open, a key goes into the padlock to free the prisoner, and the prisoner just turns his back and says, "Not today. I'm not feeling up to it." How ridiculous would that be? Now is the day of salvation. Look, dear friend, what it takes is understanding our need of God, and having understood that, understand that there is a price to be paid for the way that we've behaved, the things that we've thought, the things that we haven't done. And once we establish that, now, today, is the time to turn to him and say, "Thank you. I understand that I cannot do anything to save myself. I understand that the Lord Jesus came and he gave everything that he had, his own life, that I might be set free. I turn to him in faith and I accept this gift of life." Do you know, Dickens wrote a story called Little Dorrit? It's a long story and it's a sad story because it's about a debtor, and he's in debtor's prison. And as the book comes to its middle point, William Dorrit is freed from debtor's prison, and for the rest of the time he lives as a prisoner in his mind. Now's the day of redemption, the day of salvation. Could be redeemed today, can get out of this mess today. It needs to be claimed. Our voucher needs to be redeemed in a timely way while we're still on this earth and conscious. Well, let's think about William Dorrit, shall we? We're up to lesson 4. With lesson 4, we need to learn that the person who's redeemed is wholly owned by their Redeemer. Do you remember Ruth and Boaz? Boaz is the Redeemer kinsman. His kinsman wants to buy a piece of land that should be in the family. And remember how important inheritance is to Jewish people. But he doesn't want to pay the other price, which is to marry Ruth. And so Boaz says, I'll marry Ruth and I'll redeem, I'll buy back the land for myself. And then the land belongs to him, is wholly owned by Boaz, by God's grace, of course. But let's think about Ruth. In a sense, she is now wholly owned by Boaz, isn't she? But he's not her slave master. He's her husband. He's her partner. That's a good word for man and wife, isn't it? He's her partner. So the one who's redeemed the land and Ruth who's redeemed, is in a sense wholly owned by Boaz. But what a life. She doesn't live with chains. She doesn't get locked up at night. She lives as a person with dignity, with a life to live. William Dorrit is taken out of prison and he refuses to acknowledge that somebody's paid the price for him to get out of prison and given him money, plenty of it, to live on. But he fails to acknowledge it, and he just lives as a sad person, and he doesn't want to be reminded of this. Now, if we are wholly owned, we can say to people, look, Christ has redeemed me. I'm living for him now. Jesus said, those who are forgiven much love much. You see, we are owned by a new bond, and it's the bond of love. It's not a chain. It's something compelling, internal, spiritual. So, to be redeemed is to be wholly owned by the God of heaven. And we are anyway. And finally, lesson 5. To be redeemed is to show God for who he is. At the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 5, there is a crowd of people and gathered around the throne. And this is what they say. Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, for you are slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you've made them a kingdom of priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. The story of redemption runs through the whole Bible. The redemption that comes to the people of Israel in the Exodus, where God, he is their desperation, and he frees them from their captivity. But we see the high price that he pays, and this is represented on their side by blood sacrifice. We'll talk about that later on in this series. But they know that they've been redeemed out of slavery, because the only way to escape slavery is redemption. Think about the people of Israel coming back to the temple after being away, held as captives in Babylon. And they come back with this great joy. They pinch themselves. They say, are we as ones who were drunk? because they see something about God, that he does forgive and that he does have a plan which is about life for those who are redeemed. And Jesus himself calls himself the Good Shepherd who gives his life for his sheep, a life for a life. That's redemption. And the psalmist talks about leading the captives out. What am I trying to say badly is that the Bible teaches us that God is a redeemer, and that because of this, those who are redeemed, they reflect his redemption. Now, let's go back to that throne, shall we? And all the people around the throne, worthy are you, say the people. That's people who've been redeemed. That's people who've escaped from eternity. And who is in the center of that scene? The King. And who is the King? The King is a lamb who was slain. There he is, the price paid for our redemption. There he is, the King who owns, is sovereign over his people. There he is, the King who, in glorifying him, allows his people to speak of his greatness to the world. Salvation last week, redemption this week. They're rather similar, aren't they? I suppose you could just say that if salvation is the big picture, then redemption is the how. So if salvation is the what, salvation out of and into, redemption is the how. And next week we'll look a little bit more at another great word of the Bible, atonement. Again, it's connected. Why don't you spend this week asking God to show you how often he talks about redemption, and putting yourself in that place of asking, am I freed from the sin, the shame, and the wages of doubt, and all those things? Am I freed from those? And can I live in the light of being redeemed, owned by God, but in a new and free and loving relationship with him? And can I reflect him this week? And as you do that, may God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, give you peace. Well, I'll let you have another look at the snow.